At 72, I sat in my son's car thinking we were going to a quiet place where I could recover from my husband's death. But when the car stopped in the middle of a desolate, snow-covered forest, Derek opened the door, dropped a small bag on the ground, and drove away without looking back. No explanation, no glance, only the sound of the engine fading in the cold wind. And I stood there, alone, in the freezing winter, realizing my son had just left me to die. Like this story to support it. Comment the city you're viewing so I know how far my story has come. And subscribe to the channel so you don't miss the next part. Because this is just the beginning. The last normal morning of my life started with oatmeal. I remember that detail because it feels absurd now. The kind of small, ordinary thing that shouldn't matter but somehow does. Derek had made it himself, standing at my stove in his good wool coat like he was in a hurry to be somewhere decent. He stirred the pot with one hand and scrolled his phone with the other, and I sat at the kitchen table in my robe and watched him and thought, he came. He actually came. 3 weeks after I buried my husband of 44 years, my son had driven 4 hours to check on me. That was what I told myself. That was the story I needed. I should have paid more attention to the coat. You don't wear your good wool coat to make oatmeal for your grieving mother unless you're planning to leave again very quickly. But I was 72 years old, and I had just lost Robert, and grief does something to your vision. It narrows everything down to what you want to see. I wanted to see my son standing at my stove taking care of me, so that is exactly what I saw. "You need to get out of this house," Derek said, not looking up from his phone. "It's not healthy, Mom, sitting in here alone." "I'm not sitting alone. Margaret comes by on Thursdays." "Margaret is 78 and brings you casseroles you don't eat." He set a bowl in front of me. The oatmeal was a little watery, the way he'd always made it even as a teenager, never quite patient enough to let it thicken properly. I found a place, a cabin up north. Clean air, quiet, no reminders. You need a change of scenery. I looked at the bowl. "I don't want to travel right now, Derek." "I know you don't. That's exactly why you should." He finally put his phone down and sat across from me, and he gave me the look, the one that had worked on me since he was 9 years old, a kind of soft, patient concern that made you feel like he was the reasonable one and you were the problem. "Dad would have wanted you to take care of yourself." He said it gently. He'd learned a long time ago that he could move me with Robert's name. I ate the watery oatmeal. I agreed to the trip. I went upstairs and packed a bag while Derek sat in the kitchen and made phone calls in a low voice I couldn't quite make out. And I told myself that was nothing. That was just business. That my son had a busy life and I was lucky he was here at all. I have spent a long time, since then, thinking about the moments I almost knew. We left the next morning before the sun was fully up. Derek loaded my single bag into the trunk with the brisk efficiency of a man running a schedule, and I climbed into the passenger seat of his car. A new car, I noticed. Black and very clean, the kind of car that costs more than I let myself think about. And we pulled out of the driveway of the house where I had lived for 31 years. I watched it disappear in the side mirror. The blue shutters Robert had painted the summer before his first diagnosis. The rose bush along the front fence that had never quite recovered from that bad frost 3 years back. The kitchen window where the light was still on because I'd forgotten to turn it off, and Derek hadn't mentioned it. "How far is it?" I asked. "Few hours, maybe more, depending on weather." "You have the address?" "I know where I'm going, Mom." He said it without irritation, which was how Derek delivered most of his dismissals. Smooth and certain, like of course he knew, like why would you even ask? I had spent 40 years watching him speak to people that way, to waiters and contractors, and eventually to Robert, when Robert's mind began to slip and Derek took over managing their finances. He spoke to people the way you'd speak to a slow child you were fond of but not particularly concerned about. I had never let myself name what that was. Outside the window, the landscape changed. The town bled into suburbs, the suburbs into rural highway, and then the highway into narrower roads lined with bare trees and old snow still frozen in the ditches from weeks ago. I watched the mile markers pass. I had my phone in my coat pocket, but the signal had already thinned to a single bar, then nothing. "There's no service out here," I said. "That's the point. You need to disconnect." I looked at the trees. They were dense and dark and identical, The kind of forest that doesn't look like scenery. It looks like a fact, like a wall. Derek, where exactly? It's a private property, friend of a friend. You'll have everything you need. I waited for him to say more. He didn't. That was the moment I should have pushed. Should have said, pull over, take me home, tell me the name of this friend of a friend. But there is something about being the mother of a grown man. You spend so many years softening your concerns, rounding off your edges, reminding yourself that he is an adult now and you are not the authority anymore. The habit runs so deep you don't even notice it operating. I looked back out the window and said nothing. Sit. We drove for another 2 hours into country I didn't recognize. The road had been paved once, but most of that was a memory now. There were gaps where the asphalt had crumbled away entirely, and Derek navigated around them with the focused concentration of someone who had made this drive before. That small realization sat in my stomach like a stone. He knew the gaps. He had been here. The sky was the color of old pewter, and the trees on either side of the road had closed in enough that the light felt rationed. I turned on the heat in my coat and watched my son's hands on the wheel, and I thought about the last 6 months. How Derek had started coming around more after Robert's second stroke. Helpful at first, almost alarmingly so. How he had begun talking about finances, about estate planning, about the complexity of managing property at my age. How he had brought papers for me to sign and explained them so quickly and so confidently that asking him to slow down felt like admitting I was failing. Robert had always handled the finances. After he died, I was adrift in things I didn't understand, and Derek was there with folders and pens and that voice, that steady, assured voice that said, "Don't worry, I've got this. This is what family is for." I had signed things, more than once. I had been grateful. The road turned to gravel. Then the gravel got sparse and it was just packed dirt and tire tracks in the frozen ground. And then Derek stopped the car. There was a cabin. I don't know how to make it sound worse than it was, but the truth is it didn't look terrible at first glance. It was old, weathered gray wood, with a porch that sagged on one side and a stovepipe chimney that may or may not have been functional. There was firewood stacked against one wall, not a lot of it. A window on the front with old glass that caught the flat winter light. "Here we are," Derek said. "This is it?" "Rustic, that's the whole point." He got out and I followed him, and he carried my bag to the porch with that same brisk efficiency and pushed the door open. Inside it was cold. There was a wood stove in the corner, a cot with a blanket, a small table, a shelf with a few canned goods, a kerosene lamp, no electricity that I could see, no phone line. "Derek," I stood in the doorway. "There's no heat." "There's a wood stove. The wood's outside. You'll be fine." "How long am I supposed to be here?" He set my bag down. He didn't turn around right away, and in the moment before he turned, I felt something cold move through me that had nothing to do with the temperature of the cabin. When he faced me, his expression was, and this is the thing that comes back to me when I can't sleep, the thing I have turned over and over in my hands like a stone trying to find a different shape to it. His expression was neutral, not cruel, not guilty, just neutral, like a man completing a task. "You'll be comfortable enough," he said. "Derek, I don't understand what's happening." "You need quiet. Space." He walked past me toward the door. "There's enough food for a while. Wood to get you through a few days." "A few days?" My voice came out wrong. Too high, too thin. "You're leaving me here? Alone? In this?" "You'll be fine, Mom." "It's January. Derek." I reached out and caught his arm, and he stopped, but he didn't look at me, just looked at my hand on his sleeve. "What is happening? Please, tell me what is happening." He removed my hand. The gesture was careful and deliberate and completely without anger, which was somehow worse than anger would have been. "Take care of yourself," he said. He walked to his car. He started the engine. He drove back down the track the way we'd come, and I stood on the porch of that sagging cabin in the dead January air, and I watched the black car disappear between the trees. And I kept thinking in this strange, looping way that he was going to stop, that he was going to come back, that there was some explanation I had missed, some part of this that made sense, that he couldn't possibly be. The sound of the engine faded until there was nothing left but wind. The cold got serious very quickly. That is something people don't understand if they haven't experienced it. The speed of it. You don't get a grace period. The body starts spending heat the moment you stop moving, and the cabin was maybe 40 degrees inside already, which sounds tolerable until you factor in that I had a coat and a single blanket and a wood stove I had never operated in my life. I stood in the middle of that cold cabin for a long time doing nothing. I think part of me was still waiting for Derek to come back. Eventually, I moved. I did it mechanically without thinking too hard about the larger situation, because if I thought too hard about the larger situation, I was going to fall apart and I couldn't afford that. There was a box of matches on the shelf above the stove. There were newspapers folded underneath the kindling stacked near the wood pile. I had never built a fire in a wood stove, but I was not an unintelligent woman and I could work out the basic principle. It took me 4 tries. The newspaper flared and caught, and the kindling didn't grab, and I had to start over, hands shaking not just from cold, and on the 4th try the kindling held, and I added the smallest pieces of firewood, and watched with intense concentration while something fragile struggled to become something sustaining. When the fire was going, I sat on the edge of the cot, and I let myself think. He had driven me here on purpose. It was not a misunderstanding. It was not a miscommunication. He had planned this, the remote location, the isolated cabin, the minimal supplies, the timing in January when the cold could do the work he didn't want anyone to see him doing. He had brought me here so that I would, what, freeze? Wander off? Simply stop being a problem? I thought about the papers I'd signed. My stomach turned over. I had signed papers at the kitchen table with a pen Derek had handed me, while he summarized each document in 30 seconds, and I trusted him because he was my son, and I was grieving, and what kind of person assumes their child is stealing from them at the kitchen table? The house. Had I signed something about the house? There had been a document about estate planning, about making administration easier, about how complicated things get when assets are not properly titled. Derek had used words like survivorship and joint tenancy, and simplifying the transfer, and I had nodded and signed and been grateful that he was handling it. I pressed my hands flat against my thighs to stop them shaking. The savings. There had been account access. Something about making it easier for him to help manage things while I was grieving, while I wasn't up to handling the complexity. I had given him access to the accounts because Robert was gone, and I didn't know how to do any of it alone, and Derek was there. I had handed him everything. I had handed him my entire life and thanked him for carrying it. The first night was the worst. The fire held barely, but I woke up at 2 a.m. with the stove burned down to coals, and the cold having crept back into every corner of the cabin. And I spent 20 minutes half blind in the dark, trying to revive it with shaking hands, while the temperature outside dropped to something I didn't want to think about. I lay on the cot with the blanket pulled up and my coat still on, and listened to the wind and thought about Robert. Robert would have known something was wrong. He had always been better at reading Derek than I was. Not because he was smarter or less loving, but because there is something about being a father rather than a mother that gave him a different kind of distance. He had seen things in Derek that I had argued away, excused, filed under difficult phase, and he means well, and he'll grow out of it. Derek was 51 years old. He had not grown out of it. I thought about their last years together, when Robert's mind was slipping, and Derek had moved in to help. How patient Derek had seemed. How organized, how completely in charge he had made himself, so gradually I had barely noticed the weight transferring from Robert's shoulders to Derek's hands. By the end, Derek had been the one talking to the doctors, the one handling the accounts, the one my friends called when they couldn't reach me because Derek is better at managing this right now. I had thought that was love. I had been so certain. In that cabin in the frozen dark, I lay very still and I let myself see my son clearly for perhaps the first time in his life. He had not come to help me after Robert died. He had come to finish what he'd started, to collect what he'd been positioning himself to collect for years, and then to remove the only witness who might eventually start asking questions. That was who I had spent my life protecting. That was who I had defended at dinner tables and on phone calls, who I had made excuses for and loved with such stubborn, foolish devotion. The fire was almost out again. I got up to feed it because there was nothing else to do. By the 3rd day, I had established a grim little routine. Wake up early, revive the fire before the cold fully won. Eat sparingly from the canned goods on the shelf. There was soup, some beans, a few tins of vegetables, not enough. Melt snow in the soup pot for drinking water. Spend the middle of the day trying to get warm and stay that way. Worry about the wood supply, which was shrinking faster than I wanted to count. On the fourth day, it started snowing. I stood at the window and watched the flakes come down and understood, in a way that was almost calm, that my situation had just changed categories. A blizzard out here meant the track back to the road would be impassable. It meant no one was coming. It meant the wood I had left, maybe 3 days' worth if I was careful, was everything between me and the cold winning. I cried for a while. I'm not ashamed of that. I sat on the cot and I cried with the snow falling outside the window, crying not just for myself, but for Robert, for the years I'd lost to willful blindness, for the woman who had made oatmeal taste like evidence and called it love. Then I wiped my face and started thinking about what I could burn if the wood ran out. The chair, the shelf, the wooden crosspiece under the cot frame. I walked around the cabin touching things, calculating their heat value the way a different version of me might have once calculated recipes. There was a pragmatism that came out under pressure that I hadn't known was in me. It had probably always been there, buried under decades of being Robert's wife and Derek's mother. All the ways a woman learns to pour herself into other vessels until she forgets she was ever a separate container to begin with. I was not going to die in this cabin. I didn't decide that dramatically. It wasn't a speech, even a private one. It was more like a fact I located, the way you locate a flashlight in a dark room, by feel, by knowing it must be there somewhere. I was not going to die here. Not for my son's convenience. Not like this. On the fifth day, the snow was still falling, and I heard something outside. Footsteps. Deliberate and careful, coming around the side of the cabin. I pressed myself against the wall beside the door and picked up the only thing within reach that could function as a weapon, a cast-iron lid from the wood stove that weighed about 4 pounds. And I held it and tried to slow my breathing. The knock on the door was not what I expected. 3 solid raps, patient and unhurried. I didn't answer. "I can see smoke from the stovepipe," a man's voice said. Low, even, without particular urgency. "And your wood stack is down pretty far. I'm not here to bother you. Just want to make sure you're not in trouble." I stood there holding the stove lid with both hands. "I've got a wood pile about a 1/4 mile from here," the voice continued. "I can bring some over. You don't have to open the door. I'll leave it on the porch." The snow outside was making a sound against the window, a soft, persistent hiss. "Who are you?" I said, finally. A pause. "Name's Caleb Mercer. I live out in the tree line on the eastern edge. I've been here about 3 years, and you are the first person I've seen at this cabin, so—" "So?" I said. So I figured I'd check. I thought about this for a moment. Then I opened the door. He was not what I would have imagined, though I'm not sure what I would have imagined. Tall, with the kind of weathered solidity that comes from years of physical work outdoors. Dark coat, heavy boots, a hat pulled down against the cold. Somewhere in his 40s, maybe, with a few days of stubble and careful eyes that looked at me and then looked at the wood stack and then looked at me again. He did not look at the stove lid in my hands. "You're alone out here," he said. It was not a question. "Yes." "In January?" "Yes." He looked at the snow, at the bare branches, at the track leading back toward the road that was buried now under 8 inches of fresh white. "All right," he said, and turned back toward the tree line without another word. I watched him go. 20 minutes later, I heard the sound of wood being stacked on the porch. Solid, unhurried impacts, 1 log at a time. I stood at the window and watched the snow fall and felt something move in my chest. Not hope, exactly. Hope felt too large and too dangerous. Something smaller than hope. Something that was simply not despair. It would have to be enough for now. Caleb came back the next day. He brought more wood and a pot of something. Venison stew, it turned out, which he left on the porch step without ceremony. I opened the door after I heard his footsteps retreat and brought it inside and ate it standing up because I was hungrier than I had allowed myself to admit. He came back the day after that. On the 4th day of this pattern, I opened the door while he was still there. "You don't have to keep doing this," I said. "I know. I have nothing to pay you with. I didn't ask you to pay me." He looked at me. That same careful look, not intrusive, just present. "You want to tell me how you ended up out here? Because that's none of my business. But it's also January, and you've been alone in that cabin for coming up on 2 weeks, and someone brought you here and isn't coming back." I looked at him, looked at the snow, looked at my own hands wrapped around the doorframe. "My son," I said. Caleb's expression didn't change, exactly, but something in it settled into a kind of recognition, like a person who has heard versions of ugly things before and is not surprised but is also not indifferent. "Come in out of the cold if you want to talk," I said, even though it was his warmth and his food that had kept me alive for the past week, even though I was the one who should have been grateful. Old habits. You invite people in because that is what you do. He wiped his boots on the porch and came inside, and we sat on the 2 available surfaces. Me on the cot, him on the chair. And I told him. All of it. The papers I'd signed, the quiet way Derek had inserted himself into every financial corner of my life after Robert's mind started going. The drive, the neutral face, the hand removed from his sleeve, the black car disappearing between the trees. Caleb listened without interrupting. When I finished, the cabin was quiet except for the wood stove, which was doing its job now, had been doing its job with the proper amount of fuel for the past several days, and the warmth of it felt almost like an argument. "The property," he said. "Your house." "I signed something. I don't know exactly what. I wasn't careful." "And the accounts?" He had access. I gave it to him. My voice did not waver when I said it, and I was surprised by that. I trusted him. Most people trust their children. I trusted him past the point where the evidence stopped supporting it. I looked at my hands, 72-year-old hands, spotted and slightly stiff in the cold, the wedding ring I was still wearing. "That's on me." "Maybe," Caleb said, "doesn't make what he did less of a crime." I hadn't used that word yet. Crime. It sat in the air of the cabin for a moment, very clear and very hard. "He thought I was going to die here," I said. Not with drama, just as a fact. "Yeah," Caleb said. "I think you're probably right about that." We sat with it. The stove ticked. Outside, the snow had stopped and the silence was the kind that fills up space. "What are you going to do?" he asked. I had been thinking about this for 9 days. I had run it in circles every night on the cot, turned it over in the dark, examined all the angles, and what I kept arriving at was simpler than I expected. "I'm going to survive the winter," I said, "and then I'm going to go home." Caleb looked at me for a long moment. Then he nodded, slow and serious, like a man who understood the weight of what those 2 sentences actually meant. "All right," he said, "and he's going to answer for what he did." This time Caleb didn't just nod. Something shifted in his face, a very small change, but in the direction of something I hadn't expected. Not pity, something more useful than pity. "All right," he said again, "then we've got some winter to get through first." The fire burned, the cold pressed against the walls, and the walls held. Outside, the frozen forest held its silence like a secret. I was still here. Whatever Derek had planned for me, whatever comfortable future he had built in his head on the foundation of my disappearance, he had miscalculated something fundamental. He had underestimated how much I wanted to make it back. Caleb Mercer was not an easy man to know. I understood that within the first few days of his company, not because he was unkind, but because he had clearly spent years building a life that didn't require him to be known by anyone. He moved through the world with the practiced efficiency of a person who had reduced his needs down to something very small and very manageable, and other people's emotions were not part of that system. But he came back every day. That first week after our conversation, he fell into a pattern without either of us discussing it. Mornings he'd appear with firewood or food, whatever he'd trapped or foraged, sometimes dried provisions from what I came to understand was a more substantial setup than my lean-to cabin, a real structure he'd built himself on the eastern edge of the tree line. Afternoons he'd check on the stove, assessed the wood situation with the impersonal professionalism of someone who thought about winter survival the way other people thought about grocery lists. And then he'd leave before the light went, back into the trees, back to whatever version of solitude he'd made for himself out there. He didn't ask me more questions. I appreciated that more than I knew how to say. What he did do was teach me things. Not formally, not with any kind of instruction. More like he'd just do something and then pause long enough for me to watch. How to read the stovepipe smoke to gauge airflow. How to pack snow around the base of the cabin walls to cut the draft. How to tell from the sound of the wind whether the temperature was still dropping or had hit its floor for the night. Small, specific, survival-level knowledge that he'd clearly accumulated over years and was now dispersing without ceremony, as if it were simply the natural thing to pass between two people sharing a hard winter. I was a quick study. I had always been a quick study when the alternative was helplessness. By the end of the second week, I had taken over maintaining the fire myself. I had organized the food situation into something that might last. I had figured out which corner of the cabin held warmth the best and moved the cot accordingly, and I had repaired a gap in the window frame with a strip of cloth torn from the bottom of the extra blanket Caleb had brought over without comment one evening. "You're adapting," he said one afternoon when he came to check the wood stack and found it restacked in a more compact, better-covered arrangement than the way he'd left it. "I grew up on a farm in Vermont until I was 12, I said. "I forgot I knew how to do things." He looked at the wood stack for a moment. "What made you forget?" I thought about Robert, about the life we'd built together, about the way I had gradually become the soft interior of a structure he maintained on the outside. It had not felt like losing something. It had felt like love, like partnership, like the natural division of a shared life. "I let someone else carry most of it for a long time," I said. "After a while you stop noticing your own arms." Caleb didn't say anything to that, but he didn't leave right away either, and that was its own kind of response. Well, the cold deep in February was a different animal than the cold in January. January cold is aggressive. It attacks. It demands your attention. It makes itself impossible to ignore. February cold is patient. It settles in. It finds the seams. It doesn't storm the door. It just waits on the other side of every surface until you make a mistake, until you sleep too long or lose focus or let the fire get too low, and then it's inside before you understand what happened. I didn't make many mistakes, but I made some. There was an evening in the second week of February when I misjudged the rate the wood was burning and woke at 3 a.m. to a cabin that was somewhere around freezing, the stove stone cold, and my hands so stiff I could barely grip the matchbox. I was fully dressed under the blankets, which was the only reason the outcome wasn't worse. I rebuilt the fire by flashlight with fingers that barely functioned, and I sat in front of the stove for 2 hours with the blanket around my shoulders, watching the flame like I was personally responsible for keeping it alive through force of will. Caleb found me still there in the morning, upright on the chair, asleep sitting up. He didn't say anything about it. He just added more wood and let me sleep and made tea with the small packet of dried leaves he'd brought a few days before, and when I woke up stiff-necked and embarrassed, a mug was on the table next to me. "Thank you," I said. "You let it drop too fast. You need to add wood earlier in the evening." "I know that now." "You knew it before. You were tired." He sat across from me, his own mug in both hands, watching the stove. "It happens. Don't beat yourself up over it. Just adjust." It was the longest string of sentences he'd offered without being asked, and I looked at him over my mug and thought about what I actually knew about this man, which was very little. He'd given me his name and his location and his practical help, but the rest of him was sealed behind a quiet that felt less like shyness and more like a door that had been deliberately closed from the inside. "What happened to you?" I asked. "That made you come out here?" He looked at me. "What makes you think something happened?" "Because this..." I gestured vaguely at the cabin, the trees, the whole arrangement. "People don't build a life in the middle of a frozen forest for no reason. They come here because somewhere else got to be too much." Caleb was quiet for a long moment. Outside, a bird called once and then didn't call again. "Lost someone," he said finally. "My daughter, 4 years ago." The weight of it landed in the room between us without any cushioning. I didn't say I'm sorry. I didn't say any of the things you're supposed to say because he'd clearly heard all of them and they hadn't been sufficient, and he knew it. How old? I said. 8. We sat with that. The stove ticked. My tea cooled in my hands. Her mother and I fell apart afterward, he said. Not like a confession, more like a fact being read from a document he'd long since memorized. That happens. Most people don't make it. We didn't make it, and I couldn't be in the city anymore, couldn't be around all the ordinary things that don't know enough to be sorry for themselves. And so, he looked out the window at the trees. And so, I said softly. I'm not hiding, he said, though I hadn't accused him of it. I just needed quiet enough to hear myself think, and then the quiet got to be the point. I understood that. I had spent my first weeks in this cabin in a silence so complete it felt like punishment, and then slowly, so slowly I barely noticed, the silence had shifted into something else. Not comfortable, exactly, but honest. No one was explaining anything to me. No one was managing my understanding of things. It was just the cold and the fire and the facts, and something in me had begun to breathe differently in that context. Do you miss it? I asked. People. He considered this with the seriousness he gave most things. Some. I miss normal things sometimes. Coffee from a real machine. Dry boots. A pause. Conversation worth having. He said that last part without looking at me, which meant I understood it to be the closest thing to a compliment I was likely to get. March came in hard and then softened its grip, almost reluctantly. The snow didn't disappear. It wouldn't for weeks yet. But it changed character. The crust on top began to develop that particular brittleness that means the whole structure is compromised underneath, and the light started coming differently, angled in ways that hit the snow and scattered back in sharp, cold brightness that was not exactly warmth, but was at least the promise of a direction. Caleb and I had developed something by then that I hesitated to name too precisely because naming it seemed like the kind of thing that could knock it sideways. It wasn't friendship, exactly, though it was becoming that. It was more like a mutual recognition. Two people who had been stripped of a lot of what they'd thought defined them, and were now, somewhat against their initial intentions, in the process of figuring out what was left. He told me more things, gradually, in the way that people tell you things in the dark or near fires when the silence has been going long enough, the talking feels easier than continuing to hold everything in. About the wilderness guiding work he'd done for 15 years before his daughter died. About the accident, a fall on a trail he'd cleared 100 times. Nothing extraordinary, just the ordinary cruelty of chance. About trying to keep working after, trying to keep being the competent, capable man who knew these mountains, and finding that something essential had disconnected. That the work he'd once loved felt like performing a version of himself that no longer existed. I was good at it, he said one evening. That's what made it hard. I didn't stop being good at it. I just stopped being able to care whether I was or not. That's not a small thing to lose, I said. No. He was quiet a moment. What about you? Before all this? Before your husband, even? Who were you? The question caught me off guard in a way that made me realize how rarely anyone had asked it. Who was I before I was Robert's wife? Before I was Derek's mother? Before I was the woman managing a house and a family and the quiet, constant labor of keeping everyone else's world running smoothly? I wanted to be an architect, I said. I was good at math and I could draw. My father thought it was impractical. Then I met Robert at 20 and it stopped being a live question. I turned my mug in my hands. I don't say that bitterly. I chose Robert. I would choose him again. But there are rooms in a life you don't go back to, and sometimes you forget you ever wanted to. That's not small either, Caleb said. No, I agreed. It's not. The fire between us burned evenly, the way fires do when they've been properly built and properly fed, and I thought about all the things that burn evenly when you finally figure out how to tend them right. Odd. It was Caleb who brought up Derek first. Directly. I mean, not just as background to the rest of it. We were outside, mid-March, taking advantage of a clear afternoon to assess the track back toward the road. The snow was still heavy, but there were sections where you could see the packed earth underneath, and Caleb moved along it with the practiced read of a man who knew how to estimate when a road becomes passable again. Another 3 weeks, maybe 4, he said, crouching to press his hand against the snow surface. Depends on the next week's temperature. All right. He stood up. He looked at me, the careful, direct way he had, like he was deciding something. When you get back, he said. What's the plan? Exactly. I had been thinking about this for weeks. It had been the thing I turned to when the nights were longest and hardest, when the cold made it difficult to believe in spring as a real concept rather than an abstraction. The plan was what I held on to. I need to know what I signed, I said. Exactly what documents, exactly what they transferred, exactly how he did it. I need to find out what he's done since, whether the house has been touched, the accounts, everything. You'll need someone who knows what they're looking at. I know a woman, an attorney, or she was. Janet Holt. She and Robert were friends before Robert's mind started going. Derek didn't like her. I paused. He didn't like anyone who might complicate the picture he was building. That's probably a good sign she's the right person to call. Caleb nodded slowly. You'll also need documentation of what happened here. The cabin, who brought you, when, the condition you were left in. I looked at him. Can you do that? Would you testify if it came to that? He was quiet for long enough that I thought the answer might be no. Might be that his life out here was specifically constructed to avoid that kind of involvement, that being a witness in a legal proceeding was the last thing a man who'd retreated from the world would want to do. Yes, he said, just the one word. Flat and certain, no drama attached to it. You don't have to, I said. I know. He turned back toward the cabin. That's what makes it worth doing. I stood in the March snow and felt something pull tight in my chest. Not sentiment, or not only that, something more like the specific gratitude you feel when a person treats you as someone whose situation matters, not as a problem to be managed or a burden to be minimized. Caleb had done that from the first day. Not because he pitied me, not because he needed something from me, just because he had looked at the facts of my situation and decided they were unacceptable. I thought about Derek, about the smooth neutrality of his face as he removed my hand from his sleeve. I thought about what it meant that this stranger in the wilderness had offered me more basic human regard in 2 months than my son had in the last 2 years. The hardest conversation came at the end of March. We'd been discussing what I'd need, documents, evidence, a clear timeline. Caleb had suggested I try to write down everything I could remember about what I'd signed, dates and contexts and specific language, while it was still accessible. I'd been doing that for days, filling the back pages of a small notebook he'd given me, reconstructing the paper trail from memory with the meticulous focus of a woman who understood that the details were going to matter. One evening I looked up from the notebook and said, "He thought I was an easy target." Caleb didn't look up from the trap he was repairing. Were you? It should have stung. Maybe it would have, 2 months ago. Yes, I said. I was. I set the pen down. I made it easy. I didn't ask enough questions. I didn't read what I signed. I let my grief be a door he could walk through. That's not a character flaw. That's being human. It's a character flaw I'm not going to repeat. He looked up then. Something in my voice had changed. I could hear it myself, and apparently so could he. Something had hardened in a way that wasn't brittle but load-bearing. The difference between ice, which breaks, and iron, which holds. When you go back, he said carefully, it might be worse than you're expecting. If he's had months to do what he wanted with your assets, I know. The house might already be... I know, Caleb. I met his eyes. I know it might be gone. I know he might have sold things, transferred things, destroyed things. I know I might walk back into that town with nothing and have to prove everything from scratch. I picked the pen back up. I'm still going, and he is still going to answer for it. Caleb looked at me for a moment with an expression I didn't have a clean word for. Then he went back to the trap, and I went back to the notebook, and the fire burned between us in the comfortable silence of 2 people who had arrived at an understanding that didn't need any more words around it. The snow was melting, not quickly, not dramatically. Just the ordinary stubborn melt of a winter releasing its grip, degree by degree, puddle by puddle, the earth reasserting itself in patches. I wrote down everything I could remember, every document, every date, Every casual remark Derek had made about finances that I'd filed under helpfulness instead of what it was. I wrote it all down in my careful, even hand, the hand of a woman who had once wanted to be an architect and still thought in precise angles, and I did not allow myself to soften a single word of it. He had left me here to disappear. Instead, I had spent a winter becoming someone he was going to deeply regret underestimating. The notebook filled up. The snow kept melting. Somewhere back in town, Derek Harper was living his comfortable, stolen life, and he had no idea that the thing he'd built it on was about to develop a very serious structural problem. I was going to be that problem. I was already on my way. The road became passable on the 14th of April. Caleb walked it the day before to be certain, came back and said 3 words. "You can go." That was how he delivered most things that mattered. No ceremony, no build-up, just the fact, laid down clean. I had been ready for a week. The notebook was in my coat pocket. I had read it through so many times the pages had softened at the edges, the way pages do when they've been handled by anxious hands in the dark. Everything I could reconstruct was in there. Dates, document types, the specific language Derek had used to explain things, the account numbers I'd memorized without knowing I was memorizing them, because I'd always had a head for numbers, and Derek had never thought to account for that. He had seen an old woman in grief and assumed that grief had made her simple. It had not made her simple. It had made her distracted, which is a different thing entirely, and the difference was going to matter. The morning I left, Caleb was up before me. He had packed a bag of supplies, dried food, a water bottle, a small first aid kit. With the same impersonal efficiency he applied to everything practical, and he set it by the door without comment. "You don't need to walk me out," I said. "I know." He picked up his own coat. "I'm walking you out." The track through the trees was soft in places but held. We walked without talking much, which was appropriate. We had said most of what needed saying over the course of the winter, in the incremental way that people who live in close quarters and mutual difficulties say important things, sideways and in pieces, without ever making a production of it. At the point where the track met the road proper, Caleb stopped. I stopped too and looked at him. The morning light was thin and very clear, the kind of early spring light that shows everything without flattering it, and he looked the same as he always did, weathered and steady and slightly remote, like a landscape feature that had been there long enough to stop being surprising. "You have Janet Holt's number?" he said. "I have her address, the number I'll get from information once I have a signal." "You have everything you wrote down?" "In my pocket." He nodded. He looked at the road for a moment, then back at me. "You know he's probably spent some of it. Maybe a lot of it." "Yes." "It's going to be ugly, even with the evidence." "I know that." "You're not walking back into a resolution. You're walking back into a fight." I looked at him and felt the winter behind me, all of it, the cold nights, the careful fires, the notebook filled up in my even hand, the slow, unglamorous work of deciding not to disappear. I thought about the woman who had stood on this same road 4 months ago watching a black car drive away, who had stood there long enough for the engine sound to completely fade, who had been so stunned by the fact of her own son's betrayal that she'd held a cast-iron stove lid against her chest like a shield. "I know," I said. "I've been in fights before. I just didn't know it." Something shifted in Caleb's face. Not a smile exactly, but the territory adjacent to one. "All right," he said. "Come when you said you would," I told him. "I'm going to need your statement." "I'll be there." I turned and walked toward town. I did not look back, not because I wasn't grateful. I was grateful in ways I still don't have complete language for, but because looking back felt like the wrong direction. The road was soft under my boots. The trees thinned. My coat was warm enough and my legs were stronger than they'd been in January. 2 months of necessity, having rebuilt something that a year of grief had let soften. I walked for 4 miles before I found a signal. The first call I made was not to Janet Holt. The first call I made was to Margaret, my Thursday casserole friend, because I needed someone in that town to know I was coming before I arrived, and Margaret was the one person I was certain Derek had not reached with his version of events. She picked up on the second ring. "Evelyn?" Her voice went tight immediately, the way voices go when the caller ID shows a name that belongs to someone the world has quietly reclassified. Evelyn, is that... Where are you? Derek said you'd gone to... He said you were... I'm on the road about 4 miles outside of town, I said. I'm walking in. I need you to meet me, and I need you to not tell Derek. A pause. Then, are you hurt? No. Are you... What happened to you? It's been 4 months, Evelyn. Nobody has heard... I'll explain everything when I see you. Can you come? She came. She drove out and found me on the road, and when she got out of her car, her face did something complicated. Relief and shock, and something that might have been anger on my behalf. And she held my arms and looked at me like she was checking that I was structurally intact. You look thin, she said. I'm all right. You don't look all right. You look like you've been living in the wilderness for... She stopped. Oh, Evelyn. Not here, I said. Drive, and tell me what Derek has been telling people. What Derek had been telling people was elegant, in the way that lies built by careful, practiced liars are elegant. He told people I had chosen to go to a retreat, a wellness facility, he'd called it, which was a word that people of a certain age and income level respond to with nods and no follow-up questions. He'd said I needed space after Robert's death, that the grief had been hard on me, that I was fragile and not quite myself. He'd said I'd asked for privacy and that he was honoring that. He told people this in a tone of loving, exhausted concern that Margaret described and that I could hear perfectly, as clearly as if I'd been in the room, that tone of his, the one that made him sound like the most devoted son in the world while simultaneously signaling that his mother was a problem he was managing with great personal sacrifice. People had believed him. Of course they had. He was present and articulate in grieving, or performing grief, which is close enough to the real thing that most people can't see the seam. I was absent. Absence is always the worse argument. Has he been at the house? I asked. Margaret's hands tightened on the steering wheel. Evelyn, tell me. He moved into it, she said, about 6 weeks after he said you'd gone. Said it made sense to keep an eye on the property. He's had people over, dinner parties. She said the last 2 words in a tone that suggested she'd had opinions about this for months and had been waiting to say them to someone who would understand. I asked him about you twice, and both times he gave me that look, the patient one. Yes, like I was the unreasonable one for asking. She glanced at me. I should have pushed harder. He's very good at making people feel like pushing is the problem, I said. That's not on you. That's something he spent years perfecting. We drove in silence for a moment. The town was beginning to appear through the windshield. Familiar shapes, the grain elevator at the edge of the main road, the gas station, the diner where Robert and I had eaten breakfast every Saturday for 20 years. He's also been dealing with the financial accounts, Margaret said. Quieter now, like she was delivering something she'd been carrying for a while. One of Robert's old colleagues, Bill Torrance, you know him, ran into Derek at the bank. Derek was there with a woman from the financial department. Bill said it looked like he was liquidating something. My stomach dropped in that particular way it does when you've been expecting a blow, but the blow still lands. How long ago? 2 months, maybe? Bill mentioned it to me and I didn't know what to do with it, Evelyn, because you were supposedly at this retreat and I didn't have a way to reach you, and Derek was so certain about everything. It's all right, I said, though it wasn't, not entirely. 2 months. Whatever he'd liquidated, it was gone. The question was whether it was gone in a way that left a traceable paper trail, and I was betting, I had to bet, that it did, because you cannot move the kind of money Robert and I had accumulated over 44 years without leaving records, and Derek was arrogant enough to believe the records didn't matter because I was never coming back. That arrogance was going to be his most expensive mistake. Take me to Janet Holt, I said. Ouch. Janet Holt had been an estate attorney for 30 years and had the office to prove it. Walls of files, a desk buried under paper, reading glasses on a chain that she kept picking up and setting down as she listened to me. She was in her late 60s, sharp-eyed and unsentimental, and she had known Robert long enough to remember when he was sharp enough to be formidable. She listened to everything without interrupting. This took discipline, I could tell. There were several moments where her jaw tightened and her hand moved toward a pen and then stopped. But she let me finish. When I was done, she picked up her glasses and put them on and looked at me over them. "The quitclaim deed," she said. "That's what he had you sign. That's the most likely instrument for a fast property transfer. Do you remember any specific language about—" "It said, for estate planning purposes," I said, "to simplify the transfer of title and reduce administrative burden on surviving family." I had written it down as close to verbatim as I could remember, and I recited it from memory now. He explained it to me for maybe 90 seconds. Janet wrote something. "And you signed without independent counsel?" "Yes." "Were you under any medication at the time? For grief? For anxiety?" "No. I was in grief, but I was not medicated. I was also not given adequate time to read the document or have it explained by a neutral party." I looked at her steadily. "I know what you're building toward. The argument is undue influence. He positioned himself as the trusted family manager, he presented documents in a context designed to minimize scrutiny, and he took advantage of my condition immediately following my husband's death." Janet took her glasses off. She looked at me for a moment in a way that reminded me slightly of Caleb, that quality of actually seeing what's in front of you rather than what you expected to find. "You've been thinking about this," she said. "I've had a winter with very little else to do." "Tell me about the witness." I told her about Caleb, his name, his background as a wilderness guide, the fact that he had found me in a state of dangerous exposure, that he could document the condition of the cabin, the location, the minimal supplies, that he had agreed to testify. "He's credible?" she said. "He's one of the most straightforwardly honest people I've encountered in my life, and I've been alive for 72 years. Janet almost smiled. "All right, here's where we are." She folded her hands on the desk. "The quitclaim deed, if it's what you describe, may be challengeable on undue influence grounds, particularly given the timing relative to your husband's death. The financial account access, if he's been making withdrawals or transfers beyond what you explicitly authorized, that's potentially elder financial abuse, which carries criminal as well as civil exposure. The abandonment in the cabin is a separate matter and a serious one." She paused. "This is not a small case, Evelyn. This is going to take time and it is going to get ugly." "You said that like you think I should be warned." "I'm saying it so you know what you're committed to." "I've been committed since January," I said. "When can we start?" We started that afternoon. Janet made calls while I sat in her conference room with a cup of coffee that tasted extraordinary after months of boiled water and dried tea leaves, and I wrote out a formal timeline from memory, dates, amounts, document types, conversations, that Janet's paralegal typed up in real time with the focused urgency of someone who understood the value of what was being recorded. By evening, Janet had made contact with the county recorder's office. The quitclaim deed was there, filed 2 weeks after I had left. 2 weeks, he had waited barely 2 weeks before making it official. The property had been transferred into Derek's name with my signature on the document, witnessed by a notary I did not recognize, signed in my kitchen on a Tuesday morning with a pen Derek had handed me and a summary that had lasted 90 seconds. Seeing it on paper was different from knowing it had happened, knowing it was a weight I'd been carrying, seeing it was something colder. It was the thing itself, documented and stamped, his name where mine should have been, and the date sitting there like a verdict. Janet watched me look at it. "He filed it fast," she said. "That's actually useful. It suggests premeditation. He had it ready to file, which means he had it prepared in advance, which means the transfer wasn't spontaneous, wasn't grieving son trying to help. It was planned." "He planned a lot of things," I said. "That cuts both ways in court. Premeditation makes the fraud clearer. It also means he was careful, which means we need to be more careful." I set the document down. "What about the accounts?" "Working on it. We'll have a clearer picture by morning." She looked at me over her glasses again. "Where are you staying tonight?" I hadn't thought about that. The house was Derek's, legally, for the moment. Margaret's guest room was the obvious answer, and Margaret had already offered it twice. "With a friend," I said. "All right, come back at 8. She began stacking papers with the purposeful energy of a woman who had been waiting for a case worth her full attention. "And Evelyn, don't contact Derek. Don't go to the house. Don't let him know you're here before we're ready." "I understand." "I mean it. Whatever you feel—" "Janet, I picked up my coat. I spent 4 months in a frozen cabin figuring out exactly what I feel and what to do with it. I'm not going to ruin everything by showing up on a doorstep. I looked at her. I'll be here at 8 p.m. I did not sleep much at Margaret's. I lay in the guest bed and stared at the ceiling and thought about Derek in my house. Derek in the kitchen where I had stood every morning for 3 decades. Derek sleeping in the rooms Robert and I had shared, surrounded by the furniture we'd picked out together, the photographs on the walls, the particular quality of light in the afternoon that came through the west windows, and that I had stopped noticing until I no longer had it. I thought about him at dinner parties, playing the gracious host in his dead father's house, wearing his borrowed legitimacy like a good suit. I thought about the accounts. 2 months of withdrawals. I didn't know how much yet, but I knew Derek well enough to know he would not have been modest about it. He had waited a long time for access to what he considered his inheritance, and the patience required to wait tends to generate a proportional appetite when the waiting ends. I was angry. I want to be accurate about that. Not the hot, explosive kind of anger that makes you reckless, but the steady, low-burning kind that doesn't go out, the kind that is actually useful because it has somewhere to go. Every time I felt it tipping towards something that might compromise what Janet and I were building, I thought about the notebook in my pocket, the pages soft with handling, the precise and careful record of everything he had done. That was where the anger belonged. In the record, in the case. He had walked away from that cabin certain I would never be anyone's problem again. At 8 o'clock the next morning, I walked into Janet Holt's office and we began dismantling everything he'd built. The accounts, it turned out, told a story even Derek's careful planning hadn't been able to hide. Because money moved through systems that kept records whether you wanted them to or not, and the trail he'd left was cleaner than he'd intended and more damning than he'd anticipated. We had him. Not completely, not yet. Not in the way that ends things. But we had the beginning of the rope, and we had found the end of it, and everything in between was just a matter of pulling. Derek Harper had spent 4 months believing he was safe. He was about to find out how wrong he'd been. The thing about evidence is that it doesn't care about your feelings. I had spent 4 months in that cabin running on grief and anger and the specific fuel of a woman who has been wronged and knows it, and those things had kept me alive and moving and functional. But evidence was different. Evidence was just facts arranged in sequence, and when Janet spread the bank records across her conference table on the second morning, the facts were so much worse than I had allowed myself to fully imagine that I had to sit very still for a moment and just breathe. Derek had moved fast, faster than I'd expected, even knowing what I knew about him. Within 30 days of driving me into that wilderness, he had transferred the primary savings account, Robert's and my entire life savings, 41 years of careful accumulation, into an account held solely in his name. The transfer had been done in 3 separate transactions on 3 separate days, which Janet said immediately was deliberate structuring, designed to avoid the automatic flags that large single transfers trigger. He had known exactly what threshold to stay under. He had researched it. He didn't do this on instinct, Janet said, tapping the records. He knew the banking regulations. He knew the reporting requirements. This was not a grieving son making impulsive decisions. This was planned financial crime. The number on the page sat there and didn't change no matter how many times I looked at it. "How much is left?" I asked. Janet's expression told me before her words did. "In the original accounts? $11,000. He left just enough that a casual inquiry wouldn't immediately look like total liquidation. $11,000. Robert and I had worked for 41 years. We had been careful and consistent and modest in the way people are when they grew up without much and understand that what you have can disappear. We had built something real and durable, and Derek had moved it in 90 days with 3 wire transfers and the account access I'd given him while I was sitting at my own kitchen table in my robe, grateful that he had come. I looked at the window. Outside, it was an ordinary April morning, the kind of morning that has no awareness of what's happening inside the buildings it shines on. "The house," I said. "Tell me about the house." "He hasn't sold it yet." Janet said this carefully, like she was aware it was the best news in a bad sequence. "There's evidence he's explored it. There was a real estate consultation 3 weeks ago. according to a contact I have at the county assessor's office. But no listing, no sale pending. Why not? My guess? He was waiting to see if anything surfaced first, if any questions got asked. The accounts were liquid. He could move those fast and quietly. The house is harder to sell without a trail, especially to the people in this community who knew Robert and would notice the transaction. He was being patient, or cautious, which is consistent with the rest of his approach. She folded her hands. The good news is that the deed transfer is on shakier ground than he probably realizes. The quitclaim, combined with the timing, 2 weeks after he drove you to that cabin, and your testimony about the conditions under which you signed, creates a strong undue influence argument, especially with your witness. Caleb had arrived in town 2 days after me, exactly when he said he would. He had driven in a truck that I suspected was older than some of my furniture, and he had appeared at Janet's office in clean clothes, with the same unhurried composure he brought to everything, and he had given his statement with the flat, specific precision of a man who had spent years dealing in observable facts and had no interest in embellishment. Janet had watched him the whole time with the look of an attorney assessing credibility, and when he was done, she had said simply, "You'd hold up well on a stand." Caleb had accepted this the same way he accepted most things, with a small nod and no visible reaction. His statement documented everything. The date he first found me, my physical condition. He was specific about that, specific in a way that I found uncomfortable to listen to, but that Janet said was exactly what was needed. The minimal supplies in the cabin, the isolation, the temperature conditions, the fact that without intervention, I would not have survived the full winter. That last part was the piece Derek had not anticipated. He had left me somewhere he believed I would simply cease, quietly and without witnesses. He had not counted on there being a witness. He had not counted on Caleb Mercer living 300 yards from that cabin in the eastern tree line, or on Caleb being the kind of man who checks on smoke from a stovepipe when the smoke doesn't look right. Derek had made his plan assuming I was alone in the world in every meaningful sense. He had not been entirely wrong about that, but he had been wrong enough. 7. The investigation moved in a way that felt simultaneously too slow and terrifyingly fast. The county sheriff's department took the initial report with a seriousness that surprised me. Or maybe it didn't surprise me, not entirely, because Janet had framed it with the skill of someone who had been doing this for 30 years and understood exactly which words opened which doors. Elder financial abuse, abandonment, fraudulent transfer executed under conditions of grief-induced vulnerability. Those words had weight in a way that I hadn't expected, and watching the detective assigned to the case write them down with a focused pen gave me a feeling I had to work to contain. Not satisfaction. Not yet. Something more cautious than satisfaction. The feeling of a structure being built correctly. One verified piece at a time, knowing that one wrong move could compromise the whole thing. Derek did not know I was in town for 9 days. I want to explain what those 9 days were like, because they were not what you might imagine. There is a certain drama people expect from a story like this. The confrontation, the moment of revelation, the scene where everything comes out. But the actual experience of those 9 days was mostly sitting in Janet's conference room going through documents, answering the detective's questions with the precision I'd been practicing since January, and sleeping badly at Margaret's house while the ordinary world went on around me. I went to the grocery store once, the third day back, because Margaret needed things and I needed air, and I walked through those familiar aisles and thought about the fact that Derek was 3 blocks away in my house, probably unaware that the entire foundation of what he'd built was developing cracks he couldn't yet feel. I bought coffee and soup and a notebook to replace the one in my pocket, and I drove back to Margaret's and said nothing to anyone. On the 9th day, the detective called Janet. They were ready to make contact with Derek. They had enough to proceed with a formal interview, and the bank fraud examiner had completed her preliminary review of the account transfers. The case was not complete. Cases like this take months, sometimes longer, but there was enough to move. Janet called me immediately after. "They're going to his office tomorrow morning. Are you prepared for him to know you're here?" I had been preparing for that since January. "Yes," I said. "He may try to contact you directly. Don't respond without me present." "I understand." "And Evelyn, Brace yourself for his initial reaction to be denial. Complete and total denial. Probably with some version of the story that makes you the confused one, the unstable one, the grieving woman who has constructed a false narrative. That's standard. I know how he talks to people, I said. I raised him. What? I wasn't there when they went to Derek's office. Janet advised against it, and she was right, and I agreed with her reasoning while also experiencing the specific frustration of someone who has walked 4 miles in April boots after 4 months in a wilderness cabin and is now being asked to wait in a conference room. But I waited, because the case mattered more than the moment, and I had learned over the winter to subordinate impulse to strategy. Margaret sat with me. She brought coffee and a thermos from her house, and she sat on the other side of the conference table, and we didn't talk much, which was its own kind of comfort. Margaret had known me for 23 years and had watched me be competent and difficult and occasionally wrong and sometimes right, and she didn't need to narrate what was happening to make it real. The detective called at 11:47. Janet stepped out to take it. I watched her through the glass panel of the conference room and tried to read her posture, which was practiced and neutral in the way of someone who has learned not to let her reactions show in visible ways. She came back in after 4 minutes. He denied everything, she said. Initially. Initially, I repeated. When they presented the bank records, he shifted. He said the transfers were authorized, that you had given him full authority to manage the finances, and this was exactly what you'd asked him to do. And the cabin? He said you had asked to be taken there, that it was your choice, your request for solitude, that he had checked on you and found you well, and that any characterization of abandonment was a misunderstanding at best and a deliberate distortion at worst. She sat down across from me. He also said, she paused, just briefly, he said you had been showing signs of cognitive decline since before your husband's death, and that some of what you're claiming may be the result of confusion rather than malice. The room was very quiet for a moment. Margaret set her coffee cup down with a small, precise sound. He said I was confused, I said. Yes. I let that sit in the air between us. I had expected it. Janet had predicted it, and I had believed her prediction, but hearing the actual shape of it was still something different than anticipating it. That was his move. Of course it was his move. He had been setting it up for years, hadn't he? The patient, devoted son managing his fragile mother's affairs because she wasn't quite up to it herself. The implication had always been there, just far enough below the surface that I could pretend not to see it. What did you say? I asked Janet. I said we had a 72-year-old woman who walked out of a wilderness cabin in April after surviving a winter alone with minimal supplies, who reconstructed a complete financial timeline from memory with sufficient accuracy that our forensic accountant confirmed every major transaction, and who had been conducting a coherent legal strategy for the past 9 days without any indication of cognitive impairment whatsoever. She looked at me steadily. And then I presented Caleb Mercer's statement, which he gave in writing under oath. I thought about Caleb in Janet's office. The flat, specific precision, the way he described finding me, accurate and without inflation, which was somehow more damning than dramatics would have been. The subject was in the early stages of hypothermia. The wood supply was insufficient for more than 2 additional days. The location was not accessible by road during winter conditions and showed evidence of deliberate isolation. The subject. I had almost smiled when he said it. Even in a formal statement, Caleb managed to sound like a man filing a report on observable conditions rather than a man describing something that had genuinely alarmed him. But the facts were the facts, and the facts were not gentle. What happens now? I asked. The bank fraud examiner's preliminary findings go to the district attorney's office by end of week. That, combined with the abandonment evidence, is likely to result in criminal charges. She folded her hands. On the civil side, we file the challenge to the deed transfer next week. I've already drafted the petition. I nodded. My hands were flat on the table. I was working to keep them flat. He's going to fight this, I said, vigorously. He'll hire someone good, and they'll make the case as complicated as possible, and there will be a period where it's not clear which way it goes. Janet's voice was honest in the way that good professionals are honest when they know you can handle it. But Evelyn, the documentation is strong. Your testimony is strong. Your witness is strong, and the arrogance with which he executed this. She shook her head slightly. He didn't cover his tracks the way he should have. He moved too fast on the accounts. He filed the deed before you'd been gone a month. He was confident. He thought I wasn't coming back. That confidence is going to cost him. Derek called my cell phone that afternoon at 3:17. I sat in Margaret's kitchen and watched his name on the screen and let it ring. Let it go to voicemail. Sat with the phone in my hand for a moment and thought about all the times over the past decade I had picked up immediately, had rearranged my schedule, had softened my voice to the specific register that a mother uses when she is trying not to make her son feel criticized. I set the phone face down on the table. He called twice more that evening. The third time he left a message, which I played once on speaker with Margaret sitting across from me, her arms folded and her expression doing something controlled and unhappy. His voice on the message was, and I want to be precise here, because the tone of it was its own kind of evidence, calm, reasonable. The voice of a man who has had a shock and processed it and arrived at a presentation of the situation that he believes is sustainable. Mom, I don't know what's been said to you or who's been filling your head with this, but we need to talk. I'm worried about you. I've been worried about you since January. You know that. Whatever you think happened, I want to help you understand the full picture. Call me back. Please. Margaret looked at me when it ended. Whatever you think happened, she said quietly. Yes, I said. He's still doing it. He will keep doing it until a judge tells him he has to stop. That's who he is. I picked up the phone and handed it to Janet by text, just the timestamp of the message, which she had asked me to document. Then I set the phone down again and looked out the window at the ordinary spring evening, the light doing what April light does in this part of the country, long and amber and almost kind. I thought about the house, the blue shutters, the rose bush that hadn't quite recovered from the frost. I thought about Robert, about what he would say if he could see the particular shape his son's life had taken. Robert had known something was off. He had tried to tell me in the careful way he had, not wanting to force a confrontation, not wanting to damage what he knew I needed to believe about my child. He had tried to protect me from it by protecting me from the knowledge of it, which was the wrong call. But it was made from love, and I could not be angry at love even when it left me exposed. What I could be angry at was the man who had walked into that exposure and decided to use it. 3 weeks later, the district attorney filed charges. I was sitting in Janet's waiting room when her paralegal came out with the news, and I nodded and said, "Thank you." And I sat for a moment in the chair by the window and felt something I had not felt in a very long time. Not happiness, exactly, not relief, those were too simple. Something more like the specific sensation of the ground being solid under your feet after a long time of not trusting it. The charges were formal and serious. Elder financial abuse, fraudulent conveyance of property, abandonment of a dependent adult. The language of it was precise and legal and entirely without the emotional weight it needed to carry the reality of what had happened, but that was all right. The law does not need to feel things. The law just needs to be accurate. Derek's attorney filed a response within 48 hours. A detailed, sharply worded document that contested every element of the case with the aggressive thoroughness of someone who had been paid very well to make things complicated. There was a section about my mental state. There was a section about my quote-unquote voluntary agreement to the financial arrangements. There was a section about the cabin that described it as a rustic retreat property that I had expressed interest in visiting, and that characterized my winter there as a period of chosen solitude. I read it in Janet's office, and I set it down, and I said, "He paid someone a lot of money to call it a rustic retreat." "He did," Janet said. "How much of that money was mine?" She looked at me. "Probably most of it." I picked the document back up and read it again, more carefully, because the details matter, and I had spent a winter learning to live in the details. "All right," I said. "Let's answer it." The hearing that changed the public shape of things happened in early May, 6 weeks after I walked back into town. It was not the criminal trial. That would come later, after the slow machinery of the process had done its work. It was a civil hearing on the deed challenge, a procedural matter that would not have drawn much attention under ordinary circumstances. But word had gotten out. I don't know exactly how. Margaret probably, because Margaret had been carrying the weight of what she knew for months, and humans are not designed for indefinite containment. Or Bill Torrance, who had seen Derek at the bank with the financial department woman and had spent the intervening months feeling quietly troubled by it. Or simply the nature of small towns where the machinery of gossip runs on different fuel than malice. It runs on the ordinary human need to know what is true. By the time Janet and I walked into that courthouse, there were people in the hallway who had no procedural reason to be there. Robert's colleagues from his years of work, neighbors from our street, people who had come to our summer barbecues and our Christmas parties, and who had stood at his funeral in the cold and shaken my hand with their whole faces doing the thing faces do at funerals. Margaret and 3 of her friends. Bill Torrance, standing by the window with his hands in his pockets, who nodded at me in a way that meant something I didn't have language for but understood completely. And Caleb Mercer, standing slightly apart from the rest of them in the hallway, in the same clean clothes he'd worn to Janet's office, looking like what he was, a man who had driven in from somewhere far away because a thing needed to be done and he had said he would do it. Derek arrived with his attorney 6 minutes after us. I heard him before I saw him, his voice in the hallway, that particular register of confident composure, talking to his attorney in the unhurried tone of a man who believed the situation was manageable. Then he came around the corner and he stopped. He saw me. I have replayed that moment many times. The specific sequence of his face, the first fraction of a second where his expression simply did not process what it was seeing, the way you look at something that can't be there and your brain refuses to file it. Then the processing. Then, very quickly, the composure being reassembled over whatever was underneath it. He looked, for just that fraction of a second, like a man who had seen something he thought was buried. I looked back at him, and I did not look away. He recovered fast. He always recovered fast. That was one of the things about him. By the time he took his next breath, he had the neutral face back, the managed face, and he turned to his attorney and said something I couldn't hear, and they walked past me into the courtroom like the hallway full of people watching them meant nothing. But the hallway full of people had seen that fraction of a second too. And in a town where everyone had spent 6 months believing his version of events, that fraction of a second was worth more than anything his attorney had filed. The hearing lasted 2 hours. Janet was precise and documented and relentless in the way she always was. And Derek's attorney was skilled, and the judge was careful and gave nothing away. When it was over, nothing was resolved in the permanent sense. These things don't resolve in a single afternoon. But the judge had asked several pointed questions about the timing of the deed transfer that Derek's attorney had answered with a smoothness that was just slightly too smooth. The smoothness of someone who is prepared for a question rather than someone who knows the genuine answer. We walked out into the May afternoon, and the people in the hallway were still there, and something had shifted in the air of the building that I felt in my chest before I could name it. "You okay?" Margaret said, appearing at my elbow. "Yes," I said. And I was. Not in a clean, uncomplicated way. Nothing about this was clean or uncomplicated. But underneath the exhaustion and the grief and the still present anger, there was something that had not been there in a long time. My name was on this fight. My hands were on it. Whatever happened next, I was not a woman things were being done to. I was a woman doing something back. Caleb found me outside on the courthouse steps, squinting into the May sunlight. "How'd it go?" he said. "It went," I said. "It's not over." "No," he agreed. "But you're still standing." I looked out at the town, the familiar streets, the grain elevator, the diner on the corner, the ordinary ongoing life of a place that had spent months holding the wrong story about what had happened to me. It was beginning to hold the right one now. Slowly, imperfectly, the way truth usually travels, not in a wave, but in a seep, finding the cracks and working its way in. "Still standing," I said. The afternoon light was doing what it does in May, long and generous, the kind that makes everything look like it might be worth something after all. I was not done. The house was not yet mine again. The money was not recovered. Derek was not convicted. There were months of procedure ahead of me, months of legal motion and counter-motion, and the grinding, unglamorous work of making an institution understand something that a human being can grasp in an instant. But I was here. I was standing on the steps of a courthouse in the town where I had lived for 30 years, in the full light of a May afternoon, and my son had driven me into a frozen wilderness 4 months ago to make certain I would never stand anywhere again. He had miscalculated. He had miscalculated from the very beginning, and the reckoning for that was no longer something he could manage or contain or explain away with his smooth, certain voice. It was already underway. The criminal trial began in September. By then I had been living back in my house for 3 months, not because everything was resolved, it wasn't, but because the judge in the civil hearing had granted a temporary injunction that restored my occupancy rights while the deed challenge worked through the courts. Derek had moved out the week the injunction was issued, and I had walked back through my own front door on a Tuesday afternoon in June with Margaret beside me and a key Janet had obtained through the county clerk's office. The house was different, not destroyed, not vandalized. Derek was too careful for anything that obvious, but different in the way that spaces become different when someone else has lived in them, when another person's habits and preferences have rearranged the air. The furniture was mostly in place, but some things had been moved and not moved back. The kitchen had different food in it, unfamiliar condiments, a coffee machine I didn't recognize. Some of Robert's photographs had been taken down from the hallway wall, and the pale rectangles where the frames had hung were the thing that hit me hardest. Those pale rectangles like absences with defined edges. I stood in the hallway and looked at them for a long time. Then I went to the storage room where Derek had stacked the photographs, found them undamaged, and started hanging them back up. It took 2 hours. My arms ached by the end. Margaret handed me frames, and I positioned them, and we barely spoke, which was the right instinct. There are moments where language is just noise laid over something that needs to be felt at its actual weight. When the last one was up, I stood back and looked at the wall, and Robert looked back at me from 15 different years of our life together, and I put my hand flat against the wall next to the most recent one. Robert at 68, squinting into summer sun at our nephew's wedding, looking slightly impatient with the photographer in the way he always did. And I said, quietly, and to no one in particular, "I'm back." The house held that sentence the way old houses hold things, without comment, without drama, just the particular quality of a familiar silence that knows you. 1. The trial itself was not the clean, dramatic proceeding that people imagine when they haven't been through one. It was long and procedurally repetitive, and there were days that felt like going through the same material for the 4th time in a slightly different order, and Derek's attorney was skilled enough to make everything complicated and contested and exhausting. There were days I sat in that courtroom and felt the weight of the previous year pressing down on me in a way that made it difficult to sit upright. And on those days, I would look at Caleb. He sat in the gallery for every session, in the same seat, with the same impersonal composure. And the looking helped, though I couldn't have explained exactly why. The prosecution's case rested on 4 pillars: the bank records showing structured transfers designed to avoid detection, the forensic analysis of the quitclaim deed and the circumstances under which it was signed, Caleb's testimony about the cabin and my condition when he found me, and my own testimony, which I gave on a Thursday in late October. I had been dreading my testimony in the specific way you dread things you know you are capable of doing, but that will cost you something real to do. Janet had prepared me thoroughly. We had gone through it many times, the structure of it, the places where Derek's attorney would push and how to hold the line without becoming defensive, which reads as evasion. She had told me to be specific, to be factual, to resist the temptation to characterize when a plain recitation of events would do the characterizing on its own. I took the stand and I told the truth. I told it plainly, in sequence, without decoration. The watery oatmeal, the wool coat, the papers at the kitchen table and the 90-second explanation and the pen pressed into my hand, the drive north, the narrowing roads, the gaps in the asphalt that he had navigated without hesitation because he knew them, the cabin, the door closing, the sound of the engine. I told it plainly, but I am a human being and I had lived it, and there were moments where the plainness was its own kind of devastation. The courtroom was very quiet during those moments, not the quiet of people not listening, the opposite. Derek's attorney cross-examined me for 2 hours. He asked about my mental state following Robert's death. He asked about my history of financial decision-making. He suggested, in the careful language of attorneys who understand that suggestion is more durable than accusation, that grief had distorted my memory and my interpretation of events. I answered each question the same way. Factually. Specifically. With the precision of a woman who had spent a winter writing things down so she would not forget them and would not be told she had imagined them. At one point he said, "Mrs. Harper, isn't it possible that you misunderstood the nature of the arrangements you agreed to?" I looked at him. I looked at Derek, who was sitting at the defense table with his hands folded and his face managed. "I was presented with documents I was not given adequate time to read," I said. "I signed them because I trusted the person presenting them." That trust was misplaced. But my understanding of what happened is not distorted by grief. It is clarified by it. I kept my eyes on Derek as I said the next part. Grief takes away a great many things. It took away my husband. It did not take away my memory or my intelligence, and I would ask that those two things not be confused for each other in this courtroom. The courtroom was quiet again. Derek looked back at me for a long moment and then looked down at his hands. The verdict came on a Friday in November, cold and overcast, the kind of day that seems aware of its own gravity. Guilty on the elder financial abuse charges. Guilty on fraudulent conveyance. Guilty on the abandonment charge, which the prosecution had argued with particular force using Caleb's testimony about my physical condition and the survival margin I had been left with. I sat in that courtroom and heard the word 3 times, and each time it landed differently. The first like a door opening, the second like a weight being set down, the third like something I had been holding in my body since January finally releasing its grip. I did not feel triumphant. I want to be honest about that because I think the honest version of this matters. I felt something more complicated than triumph, a kind of exhausted, grief-edged relief that was threaded through with a sadness that has no clean resolution because its source is the fact that the person who did this to me is my son, and that is not a fact that a verdict changes. Derek Harper is my son. He will remain my son in the biological, irrevocable sense until one of us stops existing. The guilty verdict did not unknow him to me, did not unwrite the years I had spent loving him with the particular stubborn devotion of a mother who kept finding reasons to explain away the evidence of who he was. That love is not something I can try and convict. It exists alongside everything else, complicated and diminished and real, and I have made my peace with the fact that I will probably carry some version of it for the rest of my life. What I will not carry is the weight of his choices. That belongs to him now, formally and permanently, in the way that only a legal record can make permanent. He was sentenced 6 weeks later, 3 years in a state correctional facility, with additional civil judgments that would take years to fully resolve. The house was legally restored to my name by the civil court before the criminal sentence was handed down. Of the money he had moved, roughly 60% was recoverable through bank reversal and civil judgment enforcement. Not everything, not by a long way, but enough. Enough to live on, enough to do something with. The rest is in a ledger somewhere that I no longer spend energy thinking about. Caleb drove back to his place in the wilderness 2 days after the verdict. He had spent most of the trial in town, staying at the motel on Route 9 without complaint, showing up every day with the same composure and the same impersonal solidity. Margaret had tried to feed him dinner 3 times. He had accepted once, which I thought was probably a record. The morning he left, he came by the house. I made real coffee, the actual thing, not the dried approximation we'd managed in the cabin, and we sat at my kitchen table, and the strangeness of seeing him in this context rather than the one we'd shared was not lost on either of us. He looked slightly too large for the kitchen, the way people who belong outdoors look when put inside rooms, but he sat with his usual steadiness and accepted the coffee and looked around at the house with the attentive, impersonal gaze he brought to most environments. "It suits you," he said. "It's where I live. I mean, you look like yourself here, more than I've seen." I thought about that. "I've been more than one version of myself this year." "Yeah," he said. "That tends to happen." We drank coffee in the comfortable quiet that we had spent a winter building together, and I thought about everything that quiet contained, the cold mornings and the careful fires and the notebook filling up page by page, the conversations by the wood stove, the particular quality of honesty that comes from being in genuine difficulty with another person and discovering they are worth trusting. "I want to ask you something," I said. He set his cup down, waiting. "The cabin. the property it sits on. I looked into it. It's public land, technically, but there's an adjacent private parcel that Robert and I bought years ago as an investment and never did anything with. I'd been thinking about this for months, since before the trial, and I had talked about it with Janet and with Margaret and let it develop in my mind into something with real edges. I want to do something with it, something that uses what happened there instead of just trying to forget it. Caleb looked at me with that careful attention. "There's a need," I said, "for older adults who've had their lives dismantled by family, by illness, by whatever the mechanism is. Who needs somewhere to rebuild? Not a nursing facility, not charity, something with dignity built into the structure of it." I turned my coffee cup in my hands. A retreat, somewhere people can go when they need to get their footing back, with real resources, legal, financial, practical, and wilderness. I looked at him. "You know that terrain better than anyone, and you spent 3 years out there doing nothing with what you know." Caleb was quiet for a long moment. "That's not nothing," he said. "What I did out there." "I know, but you could do more." I met his eyes. "So could I. I have the property, and I have the legal knowledge we built together this year, and I have a reason that most people don't have. I know exactly what it feels like to be left with nothing in a cold place and have to figure out which way is out." I paused. "I'm not asking you to move back to civilization. I'm asking you to use the wilderness for something." He looked at the window. Outside, the November street was bare and ordinary and completely indifferent to what was being decided in this kitchen. "It wouldn't be simple," he said finally. "No. There'd be logistics, permitting, building. Yes. I'm not good at institutions. Neither am I, as it turns out. Maybe that's why it would work." I held his gaze. "Think about it. That's all I'm asking." He picked up his coffee cup, drank, set it down. "I don't need to think about it," he said. I waited. "Yes," he said. "All right, yes." The Harper Mercer Wilderness Retreat. That is not what we called it. That's far too formal. We called it simply The Ridge, opened the following September, 14 months after I walked out of that cabin and back into my life. It was not finished when it opened. I want to be clear about that because the not finished quality was intentional. We opened when we had enough to be useful, not when we had everything perfect, because waiting for perfect is how projects die on paper. There were 2 structures that first season, both built by Caleb with help from a contractor he knew and did not entirely trust, but used anyway. And the capacity was modest, and the programming was incomplete, and the first 3 people who came stayed in rooms that still smelled of fresh lumber and had views of the tree line that Caleb had spent 3 years learning to read. One of those first 3 people was a woman named Dorothea, 74, who had been maneuvered out of her own home by an adult stepchild using documents she'd signed without understanding. She arrived in September with a folder of papers she'd been carrying like a life jacket, not sure what to do with them, not sure anyone would help her understand them. I sat with her at the kitchen table, the big table in the main building that Caleb had built from timber cut on the property, which was not beautiful exactly, but was solid in the way things are solid when built by someone who understands load and weather. And I looked at her papers and told her what I saw. Not as a legal professional, because I wasn't one. As a woman who had read documents like these in a courtroom for 9 months and understood exactly how they worked and where they were vulnerable. She looked at me when I finished explaining and said, "How do you know all this?" I thought about the notebook, worn soft at the edges, the long winter, the careful, necessary work of refusing to let my own story be taken from me along with everything else. "Personal experience," I said. Dorothea looked at the papers and then looked at me and said, "Can we fix it?" "Some of it," I said. "Let's find out how much." That is the honest answer. Not yes, definitely. Everything will be restored. That is not a promise anyone can make to a woman whose life has been partially dismantled by someone she trusted. The honest answer is some of it, and maybe more than you think, and you are not going to do it alone. That was what we could offer. Not miracles, not clean resolutions, just the specific, practical, human help of people who had been through the cold and come out the other side and were willing to turn back and point the way. There's something I want to tell you now, at the end of this. I'm talking to you directly because I've been talking at you for this entire story, filtering everything through the events of a year that changed the shape of my life, and I think you deserve to hear the rest of it plain. I spent most of my adult life being someone's anchor, Robert's steadiness, Derek's excuse, the center of a household that needed me to stay in one place so the rest of it could organize itself around me. I did that willingly and without much resentment because it felt like love, and most of it was. But there is something that happens when you spend decades being necessary to other people. You start to forget that being necessary to yourself is also a legitimate use of a life. My son drove me into a frozen wilderness to erase me, because I had become, in his calculation, an obstacle. He looked at me, at this woman who had raised him, who had spent 40 years making his world softer and more manageable, and saw a liability, an inconvenience standing between him and what he wanted. I want you to hear that clearly because I think some of you know that feeling, the feeling of being looked at by someone who should love you and seeing calculation instead. The specific horror of recognizing that what you believed was care was actually management, that someone you poured yourself into has been treating you as a resource to be depleted rather than a person to be loved. It is a particular kind of violence that leaves no marks anyone can see. And here is what I learned in the cold, in the dark, by a wood stove in the middle of January with nothing but my own mind and the bare facts of my situation. You're not obligated to keep loving people who treat you as a means to an end, not even if they are family, not even if you made them. The blood relationship does not override your right to protect yourself, to name what was done to you, to refuse to accept a story about yourself that someone else invented for their own convenience. I loved Derek with everything I had for 51 years. I would have walked through walls for him. I did walk through walls for him, many times, in many ways, only to watch him take what I'd built and use it as a ladder and then knock the ladder down so I couldn't follow. That love was real. It was not a mistake. But love is not the same as permission, and choosing to protect yourself from someone who is hurting you is not a failure of love. It is the refusal to be destroyed by it. I am 73 years old. I live in my house with the blue shutters that Robert painted, and the rosebush along the fence that is finally recovering from that frost. I drive up to the ridge 3 days a week, and I sit at the big lumber table with people who have survived their own winters, and I help them do the work of figuring out what comes next. Caleb is there most days. He has built 3 more structures on the property and has plans for 2 more, and has hired a young woman named Petra, who had been a social worker in the city and who turned out to be exactly what the ridge needed, someone with professional knowledge that Caleb and I lack, and a directness that the people who come to us respond to because directness is what they've been starved of. He and I have dinner sometimes, Caleb and I, at the main building or at my house when he comes into town for supplies. We don't make a production of it. It is what it is. 2 people who found each other at the bottom of something difficult and discovered that the other person was worth knowing, and have continued knowing each other in the ordinary, undramatic way that is actually the durable way. He is still not an easy man to know. I am probably not an easy woman. We suit each other in that respect. The Ridge has served 23 people in its first year. Most of them arrived carrying paper, documents, account records, legal notices, the paper evidence of what had been done to them. Some of them arrived with nothing at all, which is its own kind of record. Every one of them was told some version of what I needed someone to tell me in January, in that cold cabin, when I was deciding whether to give up. You are not done. What they took from you is not all of you. The part of you that is still here, still standing, still capable of anger and clarity, and the specific stubbornness of a person who refuses to disappear on someone else's schedule. That part is enough. That part is, in fact, the most important part. Everything else can be rebuilt. I know this because I rebuilt it. Imperfectly, with help I didn't expect from a person I didn't know, piece by piece through a long winter and a longer legal process that cost me more than money and gave me back more than a house. I am standing on the porch of that cabin right now, in my mind, the way I stand on it every time I drive up to the ridge and look out at the tree line where Caleb's original structure still stands. I am standing there, and the snow is gone, and the world is green and loud with spring, and I am the woman my son drove here to erase. I am still here. I am still here, and I have things to do. And if you are someone who has been told, by a person or a circumstance, or by the accumulated weight of a life that has taken more from you than it's given, that you are finished, that your time is past, that you have nothing left worth protecting. You do not have to accept that. Get up, find the evidence, write it down. Find one person who will look at you and see the facts of your situation clearly, and then, one day at a time, one piece at a time, build your way back out of the cold. It is possible. I know it is possible because I did it, and I am not extraordinary. I am a 73-year-old woman who makes decent coffee and bad oatmeal, and once spent a winter surviving something that was meant to finish her. I survived it. So can you.